So I finally got around to playing Blasphemous 2. Now, full disclosure here, the first Blasphemous game is one of my favourite games ever. Done about 4 playthroughs, I've gotten the platinum, I've read the bloody art book, which I could only get digitally, and it's incredible, still worth your time, but the physical release, I'm waiting for it. Anyway, let's not get sidetracked. I just absolutely love this original entry from the game Kitchen in 2019, so when I heard there was a follow-up, I mean, safe to say I was incredibly hyped, so excited, but also there was that element of, well, can they capture lightning in a bottle again? So 1 year later, with fresh DLC just around the corner, I decided it was time to finally continue my penance and ask, how does it play today? I want to say straight off the bat, something about Blasphemous 2 really does just feel different. Now, I'm not saying it's bad, but it is different. Something I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something about the DNA, the very soul of Blasphemous, that's been fiddled with in this very subtle yet still clearly felt way that initially made the game feel like it was actually set in this completely different world. The writing as well throughout the game, there's just this very slight lack of finesse and subtlety that was present in the first, as if it was kind of trying to imitate that style. There's not as many standout lines or memorable quotes. It's actually a little too wordy at times. It's a little too verbose. And that's saying something because the first game had a lot of flowery dialogue as well, but at times, Blasphemous 2 kind of just goes on and on. There's a lot of, in the blessed temple of the Forsaken Knights, of the 9 sigils, under the darkened moon, yada, yada, yada. You know what I mean. The voice acting is good once again. Lines are delivered with a real sense of purpose. There's real weight behind them. You can tell that the voice actors actually have a real level of respect for the source material and the script. While it sometimes doesn't feel like Custodia, it always sounds like it. The sound design in general really stood out for me, whether it was the clang of metal or the whispering of ghosts or a boss sharpening a knife on a whetstone before shooting you this insidious glance. Speaking of the soundtrack is once again just firing on all chambers here. It's very foreboding, it's melancholic, it's mythical. It's once again inspired by Spanish Catholic hymns, mariachi music, and classical Renaissance. Seems like there's even more layers of really lush instrumentation. While the game sounds similar to the first, the art design as a whole definitely goes in some different directions. The art style is somewhat of a departure, especially regarding the cutscenes. That's the first thing that'll probably really jump out at you, is just how different they look. There's a lot of different opinions about these cutscenes. I know there was a bit of blowback about these. I think they're absolutely stunning, but they are very different from the first game. And personally, I don't feel like they are completely congruent with the rest of the art style in the game, which is that very heavy pixel style, but also very gothic as well, whereas these cutscenes are gorgeous, but they're these very crisp, detailed cutscenes that resemble what Blasphemous might look like as an anime series, which made me realize just how much I want a animated Blasphemous TV show. But I loved the original cutscenes in the first Blasphemous so much. They were one of my favorite parts of the game. They were just so badass, and I am disappointed they don't return again here. The game as a whole also has more visual flair, that's for sure, but it does feel a little sanitized. Visually, it's just not as distasteful and confronting as the first one was. The first one was really quite full on, and that's a bit of a bummer because I just loved how hardcore the first game was. It was just aesthetically metal as fuck, and it just doesn't quite capture that same offensive quality. It's undeniably slicker. The animations especially just feel so much smoother. Speaking of the animations, where the hell are my execution animations? This is a big no-no. That's pretty much gone here. You still can perform executions, but for the most part, you're going to see the same generic execution animation for every enemy type. I don't know why they made this decision. I don't know why they didn't bring that back. But look, the game as a whole is beautiful. They have pushed this pixel art approach to its absolute peak, and they brought with it this unrivaled level of detail. This faux retro style has never looked as good as it does here. Backgrounds and environments are as beautifully detailed and realized as ever, from forgotten cities to desecrated temples, from forsaken forests to crumbling landscapes. And the world feels populated with memorable and iconic characters who all bear the same kind of striking appearances as they did from the last game. Now, obviously, with a game like this, the real guts of it is the combat, and safe to say it is significantly improved here. Combat in the first game was okay. Here, it is center stage. It's the hero of the game, and it is really upheld by this decision to introduce 3 weapons this time around, and they're all awesome. You've got Veredicto, which is kind of like this massive mace that you can swing from a great distance, has really awesome range, and deals the most damage per second as well. You've got the Ruega Alba. I'm going to butcher these names, but this is the weapon that's kind of more like the traditional Mea Culpa. It's like a blade that you are able to perform a number of combos with. And then you've got Sarmiento and Centella, which is like a rapier dagger combo, and that's the fastest weapon in the game. Every weapon kind of incorporates some element of the Mea Culpa. The other thing that really enhances these weapons is they all have their own special abilities. So Veredicto has fire capabilities attached to it. The Ruga Alba has this really interesting one, which is called a Blood Pact, and basically you lose a bit of health, but you do more powerful hits, and that can eventually be upgraded to also regain health as you land those hits, which is cool. And Sarmiento and Centella has basically like a charge ability where you'll dish out electric strikes, and you can get 1, 2, or 3 charges, and you can expend those charges for special moves. The extra weapons really do add whole new dimensions to this game's depth. You're able to change weapons on the fly in a really seamless way, which means you can adapt for essentially any enemy. I found myself switching between all 3 weapons really often, using them really equally because they're all well balanced. This weapon diversity keeps the game feeling fresh all the way through. It just feels like you've got so many different approaches, you've got the freedom to find what works for you, and you're never just leaning on any one of them. There's no bosses or enemies throughout the game that have to be beaten by a specific weapon either, so you can just stick with one if you want, but some will obviously be exploited more easily by taking a certain approach with a certain weapon. Prayers return here as well. Now, prayers were the kind of spells that you could use in the first game, which, to be honest, always felt pretty undercooked for me. I felt like there was only ever really like 2 or 3 that were worth using, and I only ever really saved them for bosses because it felt like such a commodity. And whereas here, fervor regen seems so much more generous, and as a result, I was using prayers all the time here. They totally fixed this aspect of Blasphemous 1. They are so fun to use. They're incredibly overpowered. As much as I love the combat, there was some weird stuff going on with how it was all tuned. There were parts of it that were just really finicky and awkward. Parry doesn't always leave you totally invulnerable for a few seconds. That was constantly annoying. Inputs also just seemed ever so slightly off. There were times where I just didn't do what I thought I'd input into the game, as if it was both too sensitive and then not enough, which in the heat of a frantic battle that really demands hair trigger responses from its players, it just wasn't good enough. In saying that, none of this happens often enough to truly hamper the experience. And when everything does start working and all the moving parts come together, where you're chaining combos, switching weapons, using prayers, all in rapid succession, then there's definitely this very satisfying Zen-like flow state that's achieved, which really is worth every bit of frustration. The bosses as well have to be noted because they are on a whole nother level. They may not be as, I guess, visually striking as the first game, but they are the showstopper moments from a combat perspective. They are perfectly designed. They're always fun to master. Every one of them has that exact moment where you kind of know you've got them, you've worked them out, you've got their number this time, and next time you'll get them, even if it is with just a sliver of health remaining. And that, for me, is at the core of every great game like this. The Game Kitchen could have just done more of the same with this sequel, and fans probably would have been happy and eaten it up, but they decided to take a bit of a risk and make a bit of a big swing And they made decisions to do things a little differently, and I really think it pays off. Almost everything new works really well. The RPG elements are so much more fleshed out. You can forge really unique play styles. You can find a loadout that suits your personal preferences and the specific challenges that come your way. Each weapon has its own individual skill tree that unlocks new abilities, all of which feel like a big deal. There's deeper systems as a whole that you can just really sink your teeth into, and I found myself obsessing over crafting specific builds. The progression systems here feel so much more meaningful and full of real impact. You can tinker with things here and there, and then boom, just like that, you've found the edge that you've been looking for to get you past that difficult boss or grueling area of the game. And while it is quite well balanced, it can also be broken somewhat. You can become overpowered relatively easily and just melt bosses in an instant. The scope as a whole is so much bigger in Blasphemous 2. This one feels more open, the level design is pretty complex, the world's just more interesting to interact with. There's side quests, some of the old enemies return, but there's lots of new ones as well. The enemy variation is really impressive. While the first was much more of an experience, Blasphemous 2 just has more game to it. There's so much more to do and keep you busy. It's got a really satisfying gameplay loop where you'll go through an area, you'll obtain new loot, you'll defeat the boss, and then you'll return to the city to unlock upgrades, power up more, and spend your tiers that you've gained. The biggest, most noticeable change to the game from a design perspective, though, is just how much it commits to the Metroidvania approach. The last game was obviously more like a pixelized version of a Dark Souls game with some light Metroidvania elements attached, whereas this time the game really resembles a much more true Metroidvania where there's a greater emphasis on movement and traversal. It may be a bit more traditional in that sense, but it's a very good Metroidvania game. And I really do put it up there with some of the other classic titles that belong to this ever-growing list of games. There's all the usual satisfaction from unlocking a new method of traversal, and the undiscovered areas that come with that. These new abilities were evenly spaced throughout your journey, so you kind of always feel like you're peeling back more and more layers. And they serve as these really validating milestones of progress. Movement is obviously, of course, such a big part of this game now too, and man, it really does just feel so much better to move around in this game. The platforming especially is elite. It's one of many improved areas. There's so many different traversal puzzles throughout pretty much every area of the game, and I really kind of enjoyed all of these. The new traversal abilities, when you unlock them, feel like appropriately big moments. They're attached to the weapons as well, so again, it kind of just ties back into that really harmonious approach. It really is just a complete and total masterclass in game design. A slight tweak in art direction, some input awkwardness, and an almost imperceptible alteration to its identity can't even come close to marring what is almost a flawless experience here. Whatever small cons this new installment may have is far outweighed by the overwhelming breadth of improvements. There's an indefinable quality to the first game that I'll always adore, but Blasphemous 2 is quite simply a more definitive experience and a better video game all round. Your mileage may vary on how much you enjoy the Metroidvania genre and how much you're willing to go along with the game's hard veer in this direction, but ultimately, Blasphemous 2 is a more complete and impressive package in too many ways to ignore, and one that had me praying my penance would never end. If you even remotely enjoyed the original Blasphemous, I can't recommend this enough. If you loved the first game, however, the sequel is a must-play, an experience you should honestly just drop whatever you're doing right now to go and play, especially with fresh DLC just around the corner. This is the perfect time to pick things up. For twisted are, were, and will be the paths of the miracle. Thanks for sticking around. If you've made it this far, thank you for making me feel like my life isn't a complete waste of time and space. And if you'd like to see more of this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe. Hit us up in the comments. Tell me what game you'd like me to go back and review here on The Patient Gamer. We only review titles that are at least a year old. We're going to battle your back catalogue one title at a time. It's The Patient Gamer signing off.